Good morning. This song every time it touched me so deeply.
This is the Farah Shiraj, and is the poem from Rafat Al-Elir. And welcome back.
Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So nice to see you, each and everyone again. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Aya Benazzo.
We are here talking to you we are settler in the territory of coastal Milwaukee in South Pomo,
also known as Sebastopol, California.
So yeah, this song really hits me all
Every
the time.
time.
Incredible. I really feel it in my...
So we have a beautiful guest today as well. Lara, Omar, and Laila. Do you want to introduce
Yes, I want to introduce the guest. So, Lara Elborno. Lara Elborno is a Palestinian-American international lawyer and activist based in Paris, though her family originally hails from Gaza and Jaffa. She dedicates a large part of her legal practice of human rights work, including accompanying asylum seekers in asylum proceedings before French jurisdiction. She's also co-host to a weekly English language podcast called the Palestine Pod, which aims to support the Palestinian struggle for liberation against Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid. Thank you, Lara. It's an honor to have you with us.
Welcome, Lara.
Welcome. Then we have Omar Dajani. Omar is a professor of law at the McGeorge School of Law, University of the Pacific. He served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, later joining the office of the United Nations Special Coordination for the Middle East Peace Process, UNSCO, as a political officer. He currently serves as co-chair of the board of A Land for All, an Israeli-Palestinian movement for peace, equality, and mutual self-determination. Welcome, Omar. Enjoy to meet you. And a third guest we have, she's not present at the moment. She will appear at any time. She has an issue with the internet, but I'm going to introduce her anyway, is Laila El Haddad. Laila is an award-winning Palestinian author, journalist, and social activist. Her book include Gaza Mom and the critically acclaimed The Gaza Kitchen. She has written for publications like The Washington Post and appeared on CNN, NPR, and Al Jazeera. From 2003 to 2007, El Haddad was the Gaza correspondent for Al Jazeera English, covering events like the 2006 Palestinian election. She advocates for Palestinian rights through community involvement. She brings intersectional analysis connecting struggles against militarism, settled colonialism, and state violence globally. So hopefully she will appear very soon.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Lara and Omar. I wanted to begin, Lara, by asking about your family in Gaza. Do you hear from them? If you feel like sharing, and maybe a little bit about yourself, about your connection to Gaza, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I've never been to Gaza. Both my parents were born there. They were actually birthed by the same midwife, which they only found out years later. But my family has always been from Gaza. My grandparents were all born there. So were my great-grandparents, with the exception of my great-grandmother, maternal great-grandmother, who's originally from Jaffa, which isn't very far away. It's only an hour away by car, but that trip is an impossible one. And actually, it's one that even if you were to make today, you would see the stark difference in the worlds that actually exists, but so small is the distance between them, but so great is the reality on the ground in those two places right now. So I've tried to go a couple of times in my life. Each time I was prevented from actually accessing Gaza by Israel. And I hope to be able to go someday to visit my grandmother's childhood home, which is in the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza, which I'm told no longer exists, the neighborhood actually. But I don't really have an idea of the full extent of what's still there and what's not. I have a lot of family who has left Gaza since the genocide started. I have a lot of family who's still there. The family who's still there is displaced in tents and is just doing like what everybody else is doing, trying to survive while the genocide continues. The ones that have left are very traumatized. I don't think they'll ever be healed from this. And, you know, I speak to my uncle and he says he can still hear the sound of the zenana in his ears, even though he's been outside of Gaza now for several months. So there's going to be a lot of work to do, even the day that this ends, whenever this will end. It still hasn't ended. I think we're looking at, you know, generations worth of trauma, and it's not going to be an easy task. That being said, I think everybody in Gaza is trying to survive because life is worth it and they want to live, and they keep telling the world that they want to live and that they don't want this genocide, which has been imposed on them as some sort of an inevitable reality. The world is telling them that this is, you know, the best they can offer is genocide with some humanitarian aid occasionally. And Palestinians, of course, reject this. We aspire for full, total, unconditional freedom, just like all people in the world, and nothing short of that will do.
Yeah. Omar, maybe you could just share about your background and your connection to Palestine. Were you born in Palestine?
I wasn't. I was born in East Texas, actually. My father was born in Jaffa, like Lara's one grandmother. And his family has lived in Jaffa for generations. Indeed, my great-great-great-grandfather was part of a delegation that fled with Napoleon to ask him to show mercy to the constabulary forces that were present in the town when Napoleon invaded Palestine at the beginning of the 19th century. So we've got old roots in the city, and our experience there, like the vast majority of Palestinians, Jaffa was the political, cultural, and economic capital for Palestinians in Palestine until 1948. And in the space of about 2 weeks, almost the entire population of the town was emptied as Zionist militias bombarded it from both the north and the south. Militias that a few weeks later would constitute Israel's army after Israel declared independence. So my father's family fled from Jaffa in a fishing boat, having decided to leave just a few hours before they did, in part because they'd heard about a massacre that took place in the village of Deir Yassin, just outside of Jerusalem. And so, like many other Palestinians, they fled, figuring that they would come back very, very quickly with just a few possessions. But unlike Lara's family, instead of heading south and finding themselves in what became the Gaza Strip, my father's family fled north to Lebanon and then to Syria, and then dispersed, like so many Palestinian families have, across the world. My segment came largely to the United States and stayed in parts of the Middle East. And so my first time to go to Palestine was in 1999 when I showed up as a fairly recently barred lawyer. I just graduated from law school a few years earlier. And as peace talks were just beginning between Israel and the PLO. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a longer introduction than perhaps you were looking for.
Important, very important. Well, should we go into the peace talks then?
Sure.
Maybe just continue that thought,
Yeah.
just for us to have more background on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a funny turn of affairs.
Peace talks, right, in quotes.
Yeah,
To
totally.
be clear.
Right, absolutely. I mean, well, so this was the last stage of the Oslo process, what were called permanent status negotiations. And it was called permanent status negotiations because ostensibly peace occurred in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were first signed. And because we had not really managed to reach an agreement on either from what or to what we were making a transition. And so permanent status was this kind of way of euphemistically describing a future whose contours remained very, very much undefined as we proceeded into talks. And so I arrived, I was 29 years old, as part of a project that ironically was funded by the UK government through a British think tank called the Adam Smith Institute. And I mean, I like to imagine that it was guilt that propelled the British, after all that they have done to Palestine, to reach the conclusion that Palestinians needed a legal team to support them in these talks because they had suffered so badly from the absence of legal advice as the Oslo Accords were being negotiated. But I think it was probably to a great extent because of their conviction that lawyers would somehow make this process work better. I think another irony, though, is that my colleagues and I arrived in Palestine as part of a project that grew substantially and lived on for more than a decade, as the negotiations did. I think one of the great ironies is that we arrived as lawyers who had been working at big law firms and human rights organizations who had an idea that international law could play a transformative role in delivering to Palestinians what the law characterized as our rights. And what we found in that process was something very different. While we had exceptionally strong legal arguments to bring to the table with regard to almost every issue on the table, whether it was where a border should be and the legality or illegality, as it were, of Israeli settlements, whether it was whether Palestinian refugees have a right to return to their own country as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights promises, as well as UN resolutions, whether it was what sovereignty would mean for Palestine and to what extent Israelis would be able to maintain security installations on our territory, whether we would be able to make Jerusalem our capital, recognizing that East Jerusalem is occupied territory. And the list goes on, but I'll maybe end with just one anecdote to give Lara a chance to enter the conversation. I'll never forget showing up for what was meant to be our first real conversation about law. This was in December of 1999. The negotiations over permanent status had already been going on for about a month and a half, with big delegations, making speeches, really not negotiation at all. And we had pressed for a conversation, a session about what the legal framework should be for these negotiations. Our position was that only by agreeing on the legal framework would it be feasible for us then to explore how the various issues on the table might be negotiated pursuant to it. So, you know, we prepared heavily for this, and I arrived, a young lawyer with a bunch of binders, as if I was going to be referring to them in the talks, and began giving this disquisition about what the legal framework was. And as I was getting to the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention, its implications, and stressing the various international institutions that had confirmed the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention, my Israeli counterpart said, you know, Omar, with respect, we really don't think it's important who has said the Geneva Convention is applicable to the occupied territory or to the territory. He might not have said the word occupied. The government of Israel does not think it is. And unless you're prepared to take it to the Security Council, I think that's the end of this conversation. Wow. And to be honest, in a certain way, it was the end of that conversation. I mean, the negotiations continued for months, and of course, eventually the United States stepped up its game with regard to mediation. But the Clinton administration also took the view that international law was something that might be addressed occasionally if it were useful, as it put it, but that need not play the role that Jimmy Carter said it should play when the successful Camp David negotiations and between Israel and Egypt were concluded. And so we lawyers ended up playing a very, very different kind of role than the one that we imagined we would.
Wow.
Lara, I'm curious about your perspective as a lawyer, coming a little later on what happened with the Oslo Accords. And I mean, Netanyahu, we are seeing today videos that he was very clear. He was saying, I have no interest in this.
Yeah.
This is, my commitment is to block anything that this. Anyway, Lara, I'd love to hear from you on your understanding of what happened.
Well, I think what we've been seeing for the past 8 months is really just reflective of what's been happening for the past 76 years. So it's more of the same, nothing new. And that is that Israel refuses to comply with its international obligations. And so when you have a state which is so insistent on pursuing a policy which is in clear contradiction of all international law norms, anything having to do with international human rights law, international humanitarian law, all of the different conventions that uphold human rights, whatever they may be, all customary international law, the entire international legal framework, we can say, that has been created post-World War II, precisely for the purpose of ensuring that mass atrocities do not happen again. When you have a state that insists on systematically defying these norms on a daily basis, what do you do in a case like that? You know, if we look at the situation that we're in now, there's no shortage of good law. This is not a question of not having good law. This is a question of having a lot of law that just continues to be violated. And so when we're in this type of a situation where we've had now 3 provisional measures orders issued by the International Court of Justice in connection with South Africa's case that's been brought against Israel for Israel's violations of the Genocide Convention, every single one of those provisional measures orders has been violated by Israel. And not only that, but when the order was rendered, whether it be the first order where Israel basically said that it doesn't do anything, it's just reminding Israel of its obligations, which Israel, of course, complies with, and it basically just ignored it. Or the second order, which was more focused on the provision of humanitarian assistance to Gaza and aimed at ensuring that Palestinians in Gaza do not starve, fully conscious of the fact that Israel has prevented the entry of humanitarian aid as a policy and is using starvation as a policy. Or the very last order that we saw, where the International Court of Justice said that Israel has to suspend its military operations in Rafah. After every single one of those orders, what we saw was not only did Israel not comply, but there was actually a response that was even more aggressive, right? So we saw the order having to do with ensuring the delivery of humanitarian aid. And then after that, Israel literally made sure that less humanitarian aid arrived in Gaza. We saw the order ordering Israel to suspend its military assault on Rafah. And we see that until today, Israel continues to bomb displaced Palestinian families in their tents in Rafah. So what do you do when it seems like international law is not only not changing the material reality on the ground in Gaza for Palestinians, but it's actually leading to a state which is becoming more unhinged, more destruction, more killing, more starvation. The law is not only not able to rein in any of Israel's behavior, which is in total contradiction with all of international law, but it's literally almost having the opposite effect. So what do you do? In this situation, I think it's almost irrelevant for us to continue to speak about law, because if you ask a Palestinian, whether they be in Gaza or the occupied West Bank, or even in a refugee camp, who's been waiting for over 76 years to go home, you know, what do they think about the law? I think that's the only relevant question, is how do Palestinians experience this concept of international law? Has it done anything to change their lives? Has it changed their material reality on the ground? Has it allowed them to feed their families right now in Gaza? Has it prevented their tents from being bombed? The answer is no. So I think all of us who are in this field have been saying that the only possible solution in this particular factual context is one where every single state that has relations with Israel sanctions Israel with urgency, immediately, extreme sanctions, because that's the only thing that's going to require it, force it, compel it to comply with its international obligations. There isn't any, I don't see any other solution. I think, you know, you had the UN, I think Human Rights Council was a couple of months ago, that said that every state that is transferring weapons to Israel must halt all arms exports to Israel. That was a couple of months ago. Absolutely nothing has changed since then. States continue, primarily the United States, continue to funnel more weapons to Israel. You know, it seems like every day I'm logging on to see, oh, more weapons transfers to Israel by the US. Biden signed another, you know, how many billions of dollars in weapons to Israel. So what do you do in that context? It has to be through sanctions. There's no other way. And that means that that states have to take it upon themselves to act. We saw a little bit of this at the beginning of the genocide. You know, there were like a handful of states or so that, you know, expelled ambassadors, cut ties, but not enough. We need so much more. And I think that is, you know, the discrepancy here that we're seeing is one where the urgency on the ground requires literally every state that has relations with Israel to completely end them right now. The problem is that the political sphere, the international legal sphere, the diplomatic sphere, all of these tools move very slowly. They don't move as fast as the urgency on the ground requires. But that is the only solution. There is no other solution. Law is not the solution. Law has been unable to guarantee Palestinians their rights, not just in this moment, but for the last 76 years. Has the law been able to stop the Nakba for 76 years? Has the law been able to dismantle Israel's apartheid system? You know, apartheid's a crime against humanity. Why was that the reality before this genocide? Has the law been able to end this genocide, which has been ongoing for over 8 months? So I don't think of law as necessarily, you know, this thing that's going to save us. It hasn't so far. The proof is in the fact that it hasn't been able to so far. So we have to think about how to build power in other ways, and whether that's what other states can do on their own, or what people can do in terms of building movements, but it isn't, you know, I remember, I'll just end with this. I remember when South Africa brought their case, there was like this moment of euphoria, almost like, okay, finally, we're gonna end this. This is gonna be the way that this stops. And when we got the order, the first one, it was like, okay, finally, this is gonna be the way that it stops. But then the reality is that's not at all what happened. The first thing that Israel said was, we're not gonna comply with this. Nobody can stop us, not the ICJ, not the ICC, not anybody. So when you have a state that has that type of a perspective approach, is acting as a rogue state that is not respecting any of the, you know, the rules of the book, the only answer is total isolation. That's it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to the money.